I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speakers, who this week are Beryl, Levinger, and Evan Bloom. They run a very interesting organization called Root Change, which describes itself as a social venture organization dedicated to pattern-breaking innovation. So I can't wait to hear more about pattern-breaking innovations, and Root Change. I hope you'll tell us a bit more about the organization as well as you talk to us. Beryl is the Senior Fellow for Capacity Development, and she brings a huge amount of experience to the subject. Positions she's held include, for example, Director of the Center for Organizational Learning and Development. She's been a Senior Vice President of CARE and the Vice Chair of Interaction, and advised the United States Agency for International Development and the Peace Corps in many different countries, as well as multilateral organizations such as the UN and the World Bank and so on. In particularly, I was interested in her experience on measurement of capacity, human capacity development policy, and program evaluations. Critical issues. I cannot think of anything more important than the issue of capacity and capacity development as part of our efforts to make a better world. So since 1992, Beryl has also held the appointment of a non-profit professor of distinguished professor of non-profit management at the Monterey Institute of International Studies, which is located in California, which is a co-author of books and papers, and I think brings to the subject, therefore, undoubted experience as well as an academic mind. And her collaborator, Evan Bloom, is co-founder of Root Change, where he is also the managing partner for innovation. And he's served as Vice President for Capacity Building in PACT, which, as you know, is a very well-known body which has been specializing in innovation and technology development and such like. And he's also been the co-founder of something called the Impact Alliance, which is a global action network committed to strengthening the capacity of individuals and organizations. And he has been consulting very broadly with major US international non-profit development agencies, and we're very glad that he is here today with Beryl. And the reason they're here today is that they have been leading on behalf of the Federation a study that has been going on for the last couple of years on capacity building within the network of the Red Cross, Red Crescent. And I'm really grateful to the American Red Cross and the Anne Ray Charitable Trust, which actually made this work possible, as well as the support from the National Red Cross Societies of Belgium, Norway, Sweden, Australia, the UK, Finland, Canada, Spain, and others. There are, I think, about 23 national societies from around the world, which is a good 10% of our membership that has been involved in this very interesting and very insightful study that we'll be hearing about shortly. As always, they'll speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor for discussions, and look forward to some exciting discussions. Beryl.
Good afternoon. Years ago, when I was just a young person starting out in the world, I came upon a fundamental truth that led me to think that the world is unfair. I was in Colombia at the time, serving in the Peace Corps, and eager to help hardworking, impoverished people in the rural community where I lived. I wanted to help them overcome intense disadvantage. You know the kind of disadvantage I mean, I'm sure. Schools that offered an inaccurate and inadequate preparation for securing a livelihood, healthcare that was hit or miss, but mainly miss, and a distribution of assets that left a few with much and many with very little. Anyway, after nearly a year, I concluded it's not what you know, but who you know. If you were well connected, training opportunities were yours for the taking. Jobs were possible, and you could secure a loan to improve your livelihood. And as I said, this seemed terribly unfair to me. After all, I was a strong believer in meritocracy. Fast forward to today, to right now, to this afternoon. We stand before you, my colleague Evan Bloom and I, having just completed a 2-year adventure in learning. We examine with the participation of many people in the movement why some national societies are especially gifted at adapting, thriving, and delivering in times of rapid change, while others struggle. And surprisingly, one of our conclusions is that it's not only what you know, but who you know. And if you know the right actors, these connections can actually help you overcome rather than perpetuate disadvantage. This is a powerful lesson, we believe, one that is especially significant for a global movement based on principles of solidarity and cooperation. Our study looked at the OD experiences of 17 national societies. Among other things, we examined national society capacity to engage effectively and sustainably in organizational development, OD. Consider, please, this definition of OD: a change process that helps organizations to manage complexity effectively, achieve mission efficiently, and sustainably remain relevant. It seems as if these words were written in direct response to the realities of the movement. Each challenge you address, human suffering, dignity, and world peace, is enmeshed in complexity, rapid change, and multiple layers of stakeholders. Today's answers grow stale quickly. Their short shelf life has an early expiration date. OD functions as the vaccine that protects the movement from future obsolescence. In our study, we addressed 5 key questions. Each carries an interesting perspective. The first could be asked by an accountant. What capacity building investments yield the highest returns? The second belongs to an anthropologist. What are the beliefs that people hold that govern OD practice? The third could be posed by an engineer. How is capacity built at the local level? But the fourth and fifth truly belong to OD practitioners. Why do capacity strengths and weaknesses exist? How can weaknesses be addressed? And how can strengths be leveraged? Let me turn for a few moments, if I might, to the study methodology. Before getting too deeply into what we did to answer the questions posed to us, we'd like to offer a few disclaimers. I feel at this point like I'm advertising cigarettes and I now have to read the warning on the package. But please pay attention because it's really important. One of the main tools we used in the study is called CBAR, the Capacity Building Assessment Rubric. CBAR only measures a national society's ability to engage effectively and sustainably in OD. It does not directly measure aspects of organizational impact or effectiveness. Secondly, 17 national societies participated in the study. We did not make a conscious effort to stratify or randomize participation, although many actors throughout the movement were involved in selecting the 17 national societies that were studied. Third, the network discussed in the study, more about this later, is constructed from contacts reported by 13 national societies. In short, we went for depth over breadth. Key findings could be further tested through National Society action learning activities, as well as through a wider application of the methodology and approach that we used. So you've all heard the disclaimers, right? I'm sure we're going to get to discuss them again, but we want you to know that despite these disclaimers, we think that our major findings have significance not only in terms of their ability to guide action, but also to set the agenda for future conversations. So let me describe a few of the study activities so that you can catch the flavor of this. We wanted to learn how capacity to engage in OD is understood throughout the movement. So we held a 2-day workshop that included movement actors from across the movement. The task, accomplished through interactive storytelling, imaginative exercises, and deep analysis, was to figure out exactly how the capacity to engage in OD emerges. And from these exercises, we created collectively a theory of change. We then used that theory of change to create a tool that could be used to measure a national society's capacity to engage in OD effectively and sustainably. That tool, once again it's called CBAR, combines self-assessment with an external evidence review conducted by a team of peer researchers from a partner national society. In the course of the study, we trained approximately 50 researchers to conduct these evidence reviews, as well as to lead the self-assessment activities within their own national societies. Eventually, not surprisingly, we amassed lots of data, including CBAR scores, boxes of supporting evidence, survey results, networking information, and much, much more. A group of us, representatives from the IFRC, from the ICRC, from the Federation, the American Red Cross, and the main funding institution, gathered together to consider what we had collected and to draw meaning from it. There's a big difference between data and insight, and our job was to convert data into insight. We also identified some hypotheses based on the data review that we then tested much more rigorously. You're getting the sense here, right, that this was a co-owned endeavor. This was not a root change study. Root change was privileged to take a part in a study that truly was owned and managed and implemented by actors throughout the movement. We used standard research methods, including multiple regression and correlational analysis, to identify the importance of background factors in relation to performance. One of the most interesting aspects of the study is its use of organizational network analysis. We probed the network structure and then mapped this structure against CBAR scores. We also conducted a value chain analysis to learn more about which themes and which topics were the focus of network linkages. In short, our methods were varied, and the perspectives incorporated into the study were equally diverse. Our gracious host today, Mukesh, in our introduction, talked about root change as a pattern-breaking institution. And one of the things that we concerned ourselves with at the beginning of the study was a very deep look into what are the existing patterns of linkages, communications, sharing, and networking. We were interested in determining whether these patterns were helpful to the broader goals and aims of the movement, or whether, in fact, they were perhaps impeding realization of these aims. And we'll get to some conclusions in just a moment. In fact, let's turn right now to the findings. Maybe this is going to be a surprise for you, maybe not. I think we were astonished. For those of you not familiar with the Human Development Index, or HDI, it's a measure used in the UN system, introduced by the World Bank and the United Nations Development Program, that combines on a weighted basis 3 factors: poverty, educational attainment, and health status. We used HDI as one of our contextual variables, and we found that HDI was the only background factor strongly correlated with CBAR composite scores. Okay, HDI, basically a measure of wealth, strongly and positively correlated with the scores we were using to determine a national society's capacity to engage effectively and sustainably in organizational development. In fact, differences in human development alone account for over half of the variation in CBAR scores. In other words, if you give me an HDI score, I can, with better than 50% accuracy, predict a national society's score on this important measure. If we account for whether a country is free or not, political freedom specifically, the predictive validity of the model increases significantly So now I can predict with 75% accuracy variability in CBAR scores. Suddenly it's beginning to look like context is destiny, isn't it? That would be a really glum message, but I'm happy to say that's not the one that I'll be delivering today. But let me offer you a pair of interesting data points. Okay, here we go. Data point number 1. The number of high HDI countries that scored less than high on the OD capacity measure, CBAR. 0 out of the 6 we studied. The number of HDI countries that scored less than high on perceived effectiveness. 2 out of 6. These numbers highlight an important difference between OD capacity and OD effectiveness. We understand effectiveness as the ability of a national society to meet today's challenges without necessarily being gifted in how it will respond to what happens tomorrow. And particularly if tomorrow is going to include a novel, never seen before challenge. In contrast, we view organizational development as being entirely focused on equipping organizations to respond to tomorrow's challenges. Now, clearly there's a relationship between today and tomorrow, but they're 2 separate days. These are 2 different skill sets. And when we talked about how we understood these differences, we thought about apples and oranges. Both are fruits, both come from trees, both are good for you, both are rich sources of vitamins, but they're fundamentally different. Interestingly, in low HDI countries, national societies score better on their perceived effectiveness rating than on OD capacity. In short, they are better prepared to cope with the difficulties of their current environment than with the unknown challenges of the future. We also examine the extent to which national societies exceeded expectations by outscoring their HDI level on CBAR dimensions. So CBAR was scored on a 3-point scheme, high, medium, and low, basically. And our HDI tiers were high, medium, and low. And we were interested in the extent to which a high, medium, or low HDI country did better than high, medium, or low, whatever its category was on the various dimensions. Well, we saw some very interesting things, but I just want to share one little data point again. We found that low-tier national societies, this is to say those most disadvantaged with respect to what HDI measures, they were 7 times more likely to exceed HDI expectations on CBAR than mid-tier counterparts. Well, what does this mean exactly? National societies in mid-tier settings may be in some ways more vulnerable than low HDI societies. Low HDI societies may be really good at optimizing. Apparently, mid-tier national societies face their own kind of vulnerability, even though they do outscore low-tier national societies on CBAR. So what are the implications of these findings? First of all, OD strategies must be customized with more consideration given to the specific challenges that low and mid HDI countries face. National societies operating in low HDI countries may need to spend more time and effort on organizational development as well as on organizational effectiveness. We also looked at how national society networking behaviors affect performance. Now we're going back to it's not what you know, but who you know. I'd like to highlight just a few findings. First, all of the 5 national societies that scored the lowest on CBAR also occupied peripheral positions within the network. Secondly, the low HDI country that was our so-called positive deviant, that outperformed all other low HDI countries, was also one of the top networkers in the study. In fact, this particular low HDI country performed at the high HDI level. In short, networking builds capacity to engage in effective and sustainable OD. Third, we saw that those national societies that develop local partnerships, increase ties to actors within their same small world or clique, who cultivate exclusive ties with others, ties that others don't have, and who build relationships with non-movement actors do relatively well on CBAR. In other words, once again, networking can overcome HDI-related disadvantage. The study also helped us to identify what we call strong drivers. These are behaviors and competencies that provide a national society with a significant liftoff. National societies that don't score well, for example, on effective communication never reach the highest performance tier on CBAR. At the other end of the spectrum, a national society that scores low on foundation of sustainability will also have a low composite score. Thus, foundation of sustainability acts as a warning sign for low OD capacity, while effective communication appears to be a prerequisite for success. Those two drivers, by the way, are what we called strong drivers. If you get those right, the chances are really good that you're going to do well overall in OD. We also found that scoring low on learning skills is a strong warning sign for low CBAR composite score. This finding underscores the centrality of national society learning to relevance. In general, national societies should not focus on administrative skills, although the area is relatively weak. Our studies showed that improvement in this area does not spill over into other capacity areas. So, to conclude, let's ask a question. What is the way forward for building national society capacity to engage in effective and sustainable OD? Here are 4 brief ideas. The first is obvious: promote purposeful networking and introduce metrics to monitor it. Idea number 2, identify and publicize practices of the so-called positive deviants. These are the national societies that distinguish themselves by superior performance relative to their peers who operate in similar circumstances. 3, engage in ongoing efforts to expand analytic and learning skills in order to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, maintain relevance, attract strong partners, enhance impact, and compete successfully for scarce resources. Finally, use national society cohorts and cliques rather than individual national societies as the basis for action when undertaking OD and capacity building work, such as that done through the Intensified Capacity Building or ICB initiative. In short, context need not be destiny. Attention to the capacities that matter most, along with smart networking, can spell the difference between continued movement relevance and eventual obsolescence. Thank you.
Importance of positive deviancy. I like that one. The power of networking. Strong drivers. Destiny is in your hands, provided you network in the right way and build up the right type of social capital.
I just had one question, and maybe, I'm not sure if I fully understood, and maybe it's controversial, but you talked at the beginning about this difference between organisational development capacity and perceived organisational effectiveness. And it was, if I understood, it's quite complex, but I think you were implying that perhaps unexpectedly some of the lower HDI countries were perceived or were in actuality more effective, even though they might not have had the organisational development capacity for future. They were very adaptive in the current. And that intrigues me because I think sometimes we get very involved in structure and we forget, and I saw something from our Under-Secretary General Matthias recently about the Montreux discussion, which was, let's get back to why we're here, it's about supporting vulnerable people. And I wanted to hear a bit more about, controversially, could one say, actually, they're doing better because they're actually more effective in delivery? Or have I slightly slanted to my own designs, your comments? So I'd like to hear a bit more about that and to put on the table that maybe in the organisational development discussion, the focus on that effectiveness of delivery and perceived effectiveness, we could maybe say a bit more about that, because ultimately that's why we're here and what matters.
Well, I don't want to overstate how well low HDI countries did on the perceived effectiveness rating. The main point is that C-bar scores, which measure OD capacity, were entirely predictable based on HDI, with this one positive deviant as the outlier exception. So if you looked at the HDI score rating, you had a pretty good idea of what you were going to see. In contrast, there was more variation, so that HDI was not a perfect predictor or a nearly perfect predictor of perceived effectiveness. And what we did was we had an expert panel that just rated based on their familiarity with these national societies what they thought was the effectiveness. We pooled those ratings, averaged them, and we gave the National Society a perceived effectiveness rating. So the key word here is perceived. So basically, thank you. So basically what we're saying is that HDI diminishes as a predictive factor once we deal with effectiveness. We're not saying, well, they're all low tier, but they're just great in their effectiveness. We're saying that the effectiveness seems to be operating independently of the HDI score. And again, why this is the case, it could be, the small sample. I am hypothesizing, however, that if you're in a resource-scarce environment, you're more focused on today than tomorrow. Because just, imagine we're talking about people rather than institutions or organizations. Your task is to get through the month, the week, with a certain amount of panache and a certain amount of aplomb, and the future may be somewhat of a luxury for you to focus on. So that could be a hypothesis, or it may be, and this is another hypothesis, and they're not in conflict, that low-tier HDI national societies are really good at optimizing, using efficiently what they have, but they're limited because they're in the environments in which they find themselves.
I was especially interested in what you were saying about effective communication as a prerequisite for success. Can you tell a bit more on what you mean with effective communication?
If you remember, there were two strong drivers that we identified. One was foundations of sustainability. That makes sense, right? It's baked in, it's anchored in what's happening within the community, within the National Society's country context. And it looks at things like your ability to really engage with local practitioners, with local actors. Effective communications was a similar internal focus. It concentrated on listening skills, on also the ability to reach out and speak to your internal stakeholders at the branch level. So if you think about it, the only two strong drivers that we identified out of 13 potential were both really grounded in local place. And so we use the term communication, sometimes you think external. Yes, important to tell the story, but very important to tell the story with your internal stakeholders and engage and mobilize.
We had similar study using HDI. When we mapped the information, we found similar positive deviation when we cross-checked with the national societies, but we also found a negative deviation. Mm-hmm. We came to some conclusions there. Did you find some similar findings where you have positive deviation, where the national societies with low HDI tend to be better on the rating, and some with the middle or very high HDI tend to be on low organization development index?
I'm actually going to talk about positive deviance. The concept of positive deviance, that there are positively deviant behaviors, good things that a national society can do that, in spite of what's around them and other national societies living the same day-to-day reality, are able to outperform their HDI destiny. And one of the really important things that we see in the study is that the context of a low or mid-level HDI national society is not just about those environmental factors that Beryl described in the HDI index itself, but it's also where they sit in terms of the relationships, linkages, and ties to all of you in this room, to the movement. And not surprisingly, we know North-South dynamics. So what we find is low and mid-level HDI national societies sit on the periphery of the movement. And we looked at 9 different contact channels, things you'd want to talk about, resources you would want to exchange related to OD, things like resources on volunteer mobilization and management, strategy development, governance. In each case, low HDI national societies sit on the periphery. And even when we look at their little intense cluster, their clique, and we counted 7 of them across the movement, little intensive webs of exchange, the national societies that were on the periphery of the clique itself, of that small world, those were accounting for 100% of the low-performing national societies on CBAR. In other words, if you are a small fish in a small pond, you are very disadvantaged. On the other hand, our positive deviant was in fact a big fish in a small pond. Couldn't penetrate the massive center, the opinion leaders of the movement itself in terms of the connections and ties at center. But this positive deviant national society was able to outperform its HDI destiny, actually compete with high level by being a core player in its small world, in its clique.
I think that if we go dimension by dimension across the 13 dimensions that CBAR takes into consideration, that in some cases there's no differentiation at all between high, medium, and low. Pretty much everybody's doing pretty well on it, on that dimension. So the areas of disadvantage are not uniform. There are little puddles of disadvantage, and then there are level playing fields. It's a much more varied landscape than we probably had time to share with you in a 20-minute talk, but we'd be happy to follow up and share some more of the data. What was interesting also, we didn't comment on this, is that if you had a conflict or if you had a disaster in your country and you responded to it, that turned out to be essentially a capacity building experience for you. So low HDI countries that had that background perform better than some other low HDI countries. Again, we're trying to reduce complex findings to their essence, but the more that we dig into the data, the more interesting the pattern becomes.
Can I just give one caveat to the response to disaster? As long as the National Society doesn't get so engrossed in interregional ties and still nurtures local ties, we found that they were able to take advantage of disaster, if you will, to build capacity. But as soon as they were taken off task and lost touch with local ties and exclusive ties specific to their region, they did less well.
When you began talking about the fact that context does not equal destiny, it really struck a chord, because I think instinctively all of us who have worked in the movement are aware of the fact that it's no coincidence that national societies with strong dynamic leadership tend to be dynamic national societies and open to change. And that's why I was intrigued by the way in which you described leadership as being key. But then I would pose a question and ask ourselves, I mean, there's a difference between strong and effective leadership and what we might consider dynamic leadership. And I'm wondering to what extent, by definition, our partners, our colleagues, are prisoners of the cultural way in which leadership is developed within their societies. And then how, if that's the case, how will it affect the recommendations in terms of how we encourage perhaps strong leadership to become effective leadership?
Leadership is definitely playing here, but there's actually it's a very nuanced message, actually. In fact, a dynamic leader of a national society, if they're really good at building intense ties, we generally consider that to be a good thing. But for low and mid-level HDI national societies, what they really need to turn on is bridging capacity, bridging social capital. And if a charismatic leader can't do that, then it doesn't necessarily mean that they're benefiting the national society itself. And I think we probably see that a lot in all of our work, whether it be within the movement or outside. Strong leaders can be dynamic, but it's that special person that can actually create ties that are not only good for that person, but also for that institution. That's the difference.
I would just add that in the leadership literature, there is wide discussion, as you well know, of the notion of distributed leadership. The idea that leadership doesn't reside in a single, what sometimes is referred to as the hero leader, the single hero leader who charges up the hill and everybody follows. And when it's time to determine whether to go left or right, the hero leader indicates the direction. That distributed leadership is about having many people working together, each playing a major leadership role, and no hero solely determining direction. I think that distributed leadership model has huge implications for networking. The more people in leadership roles out there making friends, as it were, for a national society, the more favored that national society is. And over again, we heard stories about great leaders. But what we didn't hear stories about, and this is a little quick look at what we call white space, what's missing. We didn't hear great stories about distributed leadership. So-and-so is so wonderful because the 10 people or the 6 people who are running the programs really form a team and they work together to set direction and set course and inspire and tell the story of the movement to diverse constituencies. That doesn't come up. So I don't want to be prescriptive in any way, but I think that this study also suggests revisiting whether the hero model or the distributed leadership model culturally is the model that prevails.
Going back to, as you were talking, I was thinking about what is a national society. There are different models of national societies, but they are all voluntary organizations. And what is a voluntary organization? It's when people see a vulnerability and they decide that they need to do something together. They get together, they find a solution with the resources they have. So my first reaction to the finding about HDI, low HDI countries where national societies have more predisposition to invest in their own development is not surprising, because that's where the vulnerabilities are, that's where the people are most likely to get together to find a solution to their problems, because they are motivated. And vulnerability, we could say, is a hoover of capacity in this organization. So if we take into account that such organizations can develop this way, and you had one case with the Burundi Red Cross, for instance, in the study, where that happened recently, would you call this mobilization of people around their vulnerabilities and resources be part of what you define as organizational development capacity or organizational effectiveness?
I'm going to make a different kind of distinction. And that is that organizational development, the capacity to engage in organizational development in an ongoing, sustainable way, is a strategic skill. Because essentially, what is the meaning of strategy, the way we understand it in organizations? It's the ability to reposition yourself as needed in an environment that's shifting, changing, and is potentially threatening. So in the example that you give, which is around mobilizing volunteers in order to respond to a particular set of current challenges, that feels like organizational effectiveness to me. But when you move to the question of mobilizing volunteers for a readiness initiative, then there's a shift. So at the end of the day, I don't think one definition is going to fix the problem of which is which. And I actually don't think that it's important to make a tight distinction. I would just say that effectiveness is the culmination of lots of processes working together, including OD. And that yesterday's OD is producing today's effectiveness. But today's OD is producing tomorrow's effectiveness. And time kind of bleeds together after a while. But the main differentiation is that OD is, by definition, a strategic asset, and effectiveness is could be a financial asset. It could be many different assets. It doesn't necessarily only have to do with strategy. You can be highly tactical and be effective.
A little bit on the edge of this, but Burundi was a really interesting example, and this actually is getting more into innovation, but it's really related to OD and effective institutions. Burundi, on the edge of living more in a periphery space, not influencing day-to-day activities across the movement, but living actually its own necessities, actually was able to come up with some really remarkable strategies. And it's interesting to note that those strategies probably are, you ever heard of disruptive innovation or annoyance-based innovation? When it's the mother of invention. And so in a lot of ways, we really need to tap into what's happening in Burundis, in national societies that are more on the periphery, because that's where creativity has to happen. That's where emergent experimentation is happening. So the role, it's a little bit of a surprise, but if you think about it this way, the role of centralized, high HDI national societies is really to translate the innovation so that it can be diffused across the movement. The role of the Burundis is the experimentation, and that's really where we need to look to for innovation.
The question which is puzzling me really is the fact that to a large extent the HDI seems to have predictive value for the capacity building capacity, but not for effectiveness.
Less value.
Less value.
Right.
That's what I'm saying, or what I'm trying to say. If that is true, what is the correlation between capacity building capacity and effectiveness? Because to us, that's of course a very key question. If capacity building would not lead to effectiveness, yes, then the question is, should we aim for capacity building at all?
There is statistically significant correlation across tiers, but there wasn't statistically significant correlation specifically for the low HDI tier. That's the pattern, which is a really interesting pattern. So if you're mid-tier or high tier and I have your C-bar score, I'm going to be pretty good at estimating what your perceived effectiveness rating is. Low tier, not so good. So that's where the breakout occurs. And we can posit, we began to hypothesize earlier. We can continue to hypothesize. That would be a wonderful thing for us to do together. Why it is that at the lowest tier, the predictive validity drops quite radically, so that it no longer is statistically significant, but it's not true for the other two tiers. And I'll just go back to my basic hypothesis, if I might, which is when you're really focused on something, your day-to-day reality, you could optimize your resources quite considerably. Necessity is the mother of all effectiveness ratings.
Well, it's my pleasure to be today, and earlier on we signed the agreement, which is very promising. And I came to this session without any background except trying to convince our donors in capacity building and finding very often all sorts of responses. As a matter of fact, I'm drafting the blog on 5 different perceptions of the capacity building, from complete puzzled reaction to diplomats who consider it as just an ingredient for a diplomatic document when they cannot put anything else. But I was particularly intrigued by your comment on innovation on edges, which brings me back to my main area of expertise, which is internet governance. And today in internet governance there is a huge debate of the way how to preserve flexibility of internet as we know, which enables creativity on edges and possibility that in few years we will have inventions like Google, Skype, Facebook, and whatever you want. Now, what is probably, if I can make a parallel, probably the analogies are usually dangerous, but what is the possible analogy to the world of the Red Cross organizations, how to keep that energy on the edges and possibility to innovate while having some sort of centralized structure and possibility to share this innovation across the different organizations. Thank you.
So the classic example that's given is the mini steel mill. So there's this large steel mill, and it's very expensive, and countries can't produce steel because the infrastructure is so enormous. And then one day somebody comes up with this idea to have a very small steel mill with fewer features, can only produce limited types of steel, and in another few years, steel mills as we know them disappear from planet Earth. That's the disruptive innovation. So the disruptive innovation typically is fewer frills, generally smaller, generally less expensive, and that's where there is an interesting parallel with the movement. Right now, there's a cumbersome system for delivering OD technical assistance. It's probably highly effective. It's what we know, it's what we have, and there is no movement that is more committed to OD than this movement. So anything we say that's critical, it starts off with the baseline that the movement excels. But what would it look like if you had disruptive innovation and a whole new model emerged with fewer frills, fewer bells, fewer whistles, but somehow it was more direct, closer to the customer, fewer service choices, but service choices that really mattered? I'm not sure what it would look like. I think, though, again, 5 minutes in this room, and we could pretty much guess what it would look like. So maybe it would be focusing on a few core skills. We just suggested 2 of them. Maybe it would be direct delivery of services within a click. That could be the disruptive innovation, at least using the model of disruptive innovation from the business literature.
Let me just quickly, so that's the vision of what it could look like. How would we get there? Experimentation. Small scale experimentation with an evidence base that backs it up. Learning from experiences and then transferring that knowledge back to the core so opinion leaders can accelerate diffusion of best practice.
But what happens in disruptive innovation, as we know, is you get new opinion leaders out of the process.
There are about 3 points of conclusion, if I may comment on from what you say and the discussion. Firstly, I think we must be humble and learn to learn in this whole area of thinking about how to go about capacity building support. And what you've done is brought an empirically grown theory of capacity building practice, and the interesting thing I find is that you have developed the theory not sitting in your classroom, but actually observing and consulting on what real life is about. So it's the best of all theories is based on practice, and thank you for that. I think that theory will evolve and will undoubtedly be challenged and changed and hopefully improved as we go along. But it is high time that we as a movement had a theory that underpinned our work in the whole area of capacity building for our network. And in doing that learning, I think there are a couple of critical insights that you provided. One was the importance of studying or learning from the deviants. So too often, I think we are frightened of the deviants. We kind of put them away as an embarrassing members of the family to be kind of hidden away, tolerated because we don't throw anyone out of the Red Cross Red Crescent family, but we kind of cover them up somewhere in a corner. When they, with their deviant approaches, positive deviant approaches, might be actually the ones that are pointing a more progressive way forward. So finding out actively, proactively, encouraging and working and respecting the deviants may provide us with insights of doing more, doing better, reaching further, as we say in our strategy 2020. The second kind of big thought that I take away from you is that we have to become much smarter at our networking. I mean, by definition, the Red Cross Red Crescent movement is a network. And sometimes we take ourselves for granted, And sometimes we take the rituals that have grown up over 150 plus years and ritual upon ritual that have brought us to where we are as some kind of is really, without actually challenging whether or not those rituals within our network are serving the purpose that they should be serving in today's century as opposed to the century in which the movement was founded. So what does smart networking mean? And here there are 2 or 3 points that you emphasize. One, you emphasize, for example, that prioritizing the periphery is important. Because as a network, one fundamental principle of which is universality, it's very important for us that we don't network in such a way that we spin off some of our members into the periphery. And those of us who are in this room and those of us who are listening online and so on, and will no doubt reflect on this, may wish to question themselves whether or not in their roles as networkers, whether they are super connectors, connectors, or disconnectors, and we have all of them, they are being helpful in smart networking or not. And I think there are those who, for example, are at the center and accrete everything to the center. And if you're not within the heat and light of the center, you're out in the cold. And that's a very disruptive way of networking. And it's important for those who inadvertently find themselves in that kind of behavior that places them at the center, but casts everyone out in the shadow, what service or disservice what disservice they're doing to the network. So the responsibility is for smart networking is also for those who are the magnets to which others are attracted for reasons that are often out of the control of the satellites, if you like, you see. And for us as a federation and a movement, we must definitely prioritize the periphery and correct the imbalances in the networking that can hinder our work. It also means, I think, implicit in what you say is that the unit of action is not necessarily a national society anymore. In today's world, which is ever more interconnected, there are more people listening to us, online and through Twitter and God knows what else, than there are people in this room. And no doubt you will also reflect and connect to others. One thing is for sure, that nobody is isolated, no organization is isolated. And also what that means is that there's no such a thing as unconditional sovereignty of an organizational unit, whether it is our own national society or the federation or the ICRC. Whether we like it or not, and generally I hope we like it, by subsuming our individual sovereignty into a greater sovereignty, we are ourselves strengthened, and together we strengthen others, and the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But how to do that in a capacity building context, with a capacity building mindset, using smart networking, is still a challenge, and something that we must continue to address through learning more as we work on this further. This might mean, for example, looking at some of the structural anchors of the network. We have taken so many of our institutions for granted, and those institutions have served us well over the last 150 years, and this does not necessarily mean that they are immutable and will serve us equally well for the next 150 years. And those of us who care as much for the future as we do about the past, which you said was the whole point of organizational development, must bear that in mind. That the past is, as I said elsewhere, is a platform from which to launch forth into the future. It is not a prison to hold you back. Finally, I think, if I may say so, the kind of internal things we take away from this is that we will have to really relook quite significantly how we go about doing OD. And that may have implications for our internal structures, certainly will have implications for our strategies. But one of the things that you said was very interesting is that actually capacity building, OD, national society development are states of mind as much as issues of structure, systems, and bureaucracy. And I think that's extremely important to get hold of. Structures and systems are an outcome of ideas you want to promote. They are not the drivers. They are not the key drivers of the change you want to bring about in the world that we inhabit, and the aspirations that we have as a movement. Because in the end, the Red Cross, Red Crescent, if it isn't about change, it's about nothing else, really. Change on behalf of the vulnerable, and change to make a better world, a more peaceful world, as our Constitution and as our Strategy 2020 says. In postscript, I wish we had discussed more on leadership, and maybe that is the subject of another discussion. I can't think of a more important subject than leadership, which on one hand has enormous power to liberate us, to move forward, and on the other hand is also probably holding us back. In other words, the styles and content of leadership, and leadership for whom, whether it's the hero forms of leadership, as you said, or distributive forms of leadership, will probably guide, will probably dictate our health and well-being as a network into the decades to come. And therefore, that's a flag or a signal for some more detailed work that we will come back to do. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to continued debate in the weeks ahead.
Thank you.
If I may add a couple of words, I feel some emotion now because it's since 2 years that we have been working together. But it's also since 3 years that we have been talking about this study, and Mrs. Nanbezal from the American Red Cross, when I was presenting one of our programs for fundraising purposes on the terrace outside, said to me, but do you have a study that actually can convince us that this is the right approach, etc. And then she came back with some partners and a solution for us to come up with a study. And you have not been consultants to us, you have been friends that actually share the same passion. That has been really nice to work together for that. And I would like also to congratulate you because you have turned 3 hours of presentation this morning into 20 effective minutes now, so I think it's a big success. And this represents the Maison Tavel in Geneva. That was the first address of the Red Cross, where Henri Dunant lived. And if I may use your metaphor, this is where he asked himself, what do I know? And wrote the Souvenir of Solferino. And this is where he also asked himself, who do I know? And started to write to Gustave Moynier and to the head of states in Europe, etc., to start the Red Cross. So I will personally show you this house to you this evening as we go to the restaurant. And I thank you again. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.